Hello and welcome to this special webcast, a project of the Freedom Forum Institute's Power Shift Project. Our topic today, workplace integrity. The tone starts at the top. Now, how do we define workplace integrity? Well, it's environments free of harassment, discrimination, and incivility, and filled with opportunity, especially for those who've traditionally been denied it. Over the course of this webcast, you will see 3 segments. First of all, laying down the law is just the start. Secondly, how do you qualify as an ally? And finally, we'll have strategy sharing and fresh approaches from leaders in media across the country. How did the Power Shift Project come to be? Take a look.
Amid growing reports of sexual harassment.
From Hollywood to Capitol Hill to the media.
The most vulnerable. It could be through being a minority, through being a woman.
Disturbing allegations from 6 women.
How many of these stories are out there?
Be honest with ourselves about what's happening within our organizations.
We push other companies and we report on them. We're not great at doing that about ourselves.
In late 2017, when Me Too revelations exposed sexual harassment and misconduct in many media organizations, we immediately began looking at what role we could play in creating meaningful and sustainable change within the industry. When we convened the first Power Shift Summit, we didn't know how many people would be willing to participate and have these really difficult conversations. The most memorable moments have been seeing the commitment of media companies who want to solve this problem.
You have to have organizational culture change. You have to have leaders who really want to make a change in the workplace.
Our goal is workplace integrity, and we define that as workplaces free of harassment and discrimination and full of opportunity.
Empowering people who are seeing this stuff happen to tell someone.
My father was a big champion of diversity and promoting women and people of color. Diversity and inclusion is really in our DNA and in all the programs we do.
How many people in this past year have introduced the subjects of harassment, discrimination into your conversations in ways you haven't before?
We believe that we can improve the quality and future of journalism if we work together and we create safer, more inclusive, and diverse media organizations.
That's how the Power Shift Project came to be. You saw her in the video. Let me introduce the Freedom Forum Chair and CEO, Jan Newharth. Jan?
Thank you and good morning. Since we launched the Power Shift Project 18 months ago, we've done a significant amount of teaching, but we've also done a great deal of listening and learning. In our summits and workshops and at our meetings with diverse groups of advisors, we've heard about the importance of changing organizational cultures. But time and again, we've also heard that employees are looking to those at the very top of their organizations for genuine, lasting commitment. Just because we're no longer hearing waves of stories about sexual misconduct scandals in media organizations, that does not mean we're where we need to be. We can't stand down. Systemic change only happens with persistence and with a tone that starts at the top and energizes and empowers others. And that's why we're here today, to focus on what those in positions of power can do, should do, and are doing to address workplace harassment and discrimination. So let's get started. I'd like to introduce Kathy Trost, Executive Director of the Freedom Forum Institute, who oversees the Power Shift Project, to begin our program.
Thank you, Jan. We're here today to talk about what great leaders should know and should do to create safer, healthier, more equitable workplaces. And to get things started this morning, we have with us one of the country's leading experts on the legal and cultural issues that are driving workplace problems and solutions. As a commissioner of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Hai Feldblum helped lead the groundbreaking EEOC Select Task Force on Study of Harassment in the Workplace. Now a partner at Morgan Lewis, she applies those research findings into real-world advice and action. Here at the Power Shift Project, the EEOC, and especially that task force, has been an invaluable source of evidence and insight. We welcome Hai Feldblum now to explain to us how laying down the law is just the start. Welcome, Hai.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. It is a delight to be here. And I want to say that I have worked with these three incredible women that you have now seen, Jen, Kathy, and Jill, on various events and projects, and I could not be more thrilled than to join them in joining you right now to talk about this issue. So this was the title that actually was given me. Leadership Secrets, Laying Down the Law is Just the Start. And that's certainly true because let me tell you, the law is really, in a sense, almost the smallest piece of this. So much of this is about the leadership. So we are in a moment of change. I think we all know that. We can see it, we can hear it, we can feel it. The challenge is to make significant and sustainable change come out of this moment. And that is absolutely possible. That is absolutely possible. But one has to be intentional about it. It doesn't happen on its own, and it doesn't happen quickly. You heard about the task force that the EEOC put out. I worked on this with my colleague, Commissioner Vicki Lipnick. We put out that report in June 2016, based on what we had been seeing at the EEOC in terms of persistent problems. Then in October 2017, Harvey Weinstein happened, and then lots of other folks afterwards, and that caught the attention. It caught the attention of the media, of employers, employees, foundations, community groups, the average person on the street. We have people's attention. You, as media companies, are incredibly important of part of that effort. But that also means that it is incredibly important in terms of what you do within your own organizations. So, one of the things that I always like to stress is that although what has caught the attention of the nation were the allegations of sexual harassment, when you think about the type of leadership you're going to engage in, the type of change, significant and sustainable change you are going to create in your organizations, you absolutely need to be thinking broader than just sexual harassment, because harassment occurs on many bases that are currently covered under the law: race and disability and religion, etc. And I will tell you that just looking at one snippet of information, that is the charges that come to the EEOC, without a doubt, sex-based harassment charges, which can be, by the way, either sexual harassment, it has some sort of sexual component, or no sexual component at all, but just simple gender-based harassment, the type of sexist comments that make it clear that the woman is not treated the same way or accepted. Well, those are the largest percentage, 46%. Race-based charges are right beyond that. And you've got all the others as well. The structural solutions to stopping harassment are going to be the same, regardless of the basis for the harassment. So you want to be thinking about it that way from the beginning. Thank you. Okay, so the other piece is you want to look beyond simply harassment. We talk about creating a safe, respectful, and inclusive workplace. So safe means that workers feel psychologically and physically safe. And that should be on any basis or on a protected basis. So that they're feeling psychologically safe in terms of any comments, etc., and that they're feeling physically safe. But you also want people to feel respected in the workplace. That they're not trivialized, that they're not humiliated, that they're treated and acknowledged as individuals. One researcher told the task force that uncivil behavior can be the gateway drug to illegal harassment. You want to stop the uncivil behavior from the get-go. And then finally, you want it to be an inclusive workplace. Obviously, we talk about diversity and inclusion a fair amount. We have some sense about diversity and how to try to bring in diverse individuals to your organization. But then the key is that they feel included. And many of the pieces around respect, simple respect, is going to be key in terms of inclusiveness. So I think everyone who's watching this knows that what they want is a safe, respectful, and inclusive workplace. Again, I am sure that sort of in your gut, you know that's a good workplace to have. The report that the EOC put out laid some of the sort of practical reasons why you would want that type of workplace in case you need to convince anyone else. So obviously, it reduces legal costs, and that's the direct legal costs. You don't want to have to be defending a lawsuit where someone has claimed harassment. But there are actually other costs that are indirect, that are even greater on the organization, even more problematic. So if you actually have a safe, respectful, and inclusive workplace, you will increase the productivity of your employees. You will reduce adverse health impacts because both someone who is a target of harassment or disrespectful behavior is likely to experience physical and psychological problems, as well as people who see that harassment or disrespectful behavior happening. You will increase job retention. People will stay. I can't tell you how much the research tells us that what most people do who experience harassment is they don't speak up, they don't complain internally, they leave. If they can leave, that's what they do. And again, it's not just the target that leaves, it is whoever it is who is watching that happening. And you will often never know that that's why the person left. And finally, it reduces your reputational costs. It is not a good thing for your brand, for who you are as a company, if there is a high-level harassment complaint. Okay, so as I said, I assume that most people watching this, you already know that this is what you want, a safe, respectful, and inclusive workplace. You also can have the data in hand to convince anyone else who needs a little fire in his or her belly. But then the question is, what do you do? And essentially, it comes down to changing workplace culture. That is the bottom line. The way to have a safe, respectful, and inclusive workplace is to have a culture in which those values are completely embedded in your workplace. So one thing that I have now discovered, just even in, while I was at the EOC and now in my new position at Morgan Lewis, is that collaboration and synergy is essential. So think right now, whoever it is who's watching this webinar, who are you? Are you HR folks? Are you folks in the legal department? Are you someone in the top leadership? The key thing you should be thinking is, who's not here in terms of these conversations? Because I will tell you, to make this work, you need all the divisions in your organization that have some responsibility for this area. So you need the HR folks. If you have diversity and inclusion, you need those folks. You need your legal folks. Don't just bring them in when there's a problem. You want their head in the game from the beginning. You need your communications people because you need to be doing internal messaging as well as external. And of course, the very top leadership is key. So if you're sitting somewhere and the CEO is not there or the head of operations, you can just send them this link afterwards and say, clearly, something you need to watch before you go to sleep tonight or at any point during the day. Okay, so you're engaged. Now, okay, you're saying, fine, I get it, workplace culture. Actually, that makes sense. How do we figure out what our culture is now in order to figure out how we might want to change it? So assessments are key. And there are two types of assessments that you want to do. You want to do a structural assessment, assessment of systems, and a cultural assessment. So the assessment of your systems are precisely that. Number one, do I have a mission and values statement that people know, that people sort of see in a practical way? What do my policies look like? Are they clear? What do they say? What do my procedures look like in terms of reporting and then investigating? What do my accountability mechanisms look like? How do we apply corrective action, and are we doing proportionate corrective actions? And then training. Those are all your systems. But then you need to assess your culture. And the way that the research shows you can do it is through a workplace cultural assessment, which I'll talk a bit about more in a second. And then you analyze the data from both of those assessments and you come up with a strategic plan. So what are the cultural assessments? And in my new title, I mean, I'm a partner at Morgan Lewis, but my other title is Director, Workplace Culture Consulting. Because even though I'm coming in as a lawyer, I'm coming in as a lawyer that wants to help organizations figure out their culture. And workplace cultural assessments use both qualitative and quantitative data. And those really are the best cultural assessments. There are a lot of purely quantitative data surveys out there. You know, I've looked at many of them. They all give you something. But just asking questions in a survey is not going to get you the same type of nuanced information that you're going to get from the qualitative data. And the way we do it is through focus groups and individual interviews of randomly selected employees, just sort of going through randomly selected employees. Depending on how large the company or organization is, you might want to do focus groups of specific demographics, you know, just people of color, just women. Definitely focus groups of supervisors and non-supervisors. And individual interviews, because you get information from an individual interview that you won't get in a focus group. And then we always create a system where someone who has not been selected randomly can self-select and say, I would like to be interviewed. Because there are people who have information that they're willing and interested in sharing, and you want to hear that. And then we create a portal, so if people want to send in narratives anonymously, they can do that. The key with all of this is that people are assured of their confidentiality. So one of the benefits of bringing in a third party is the employer can say, we care about this. We want to know and hear from you, and we want to do it in a way that feels safe to you. So you have a third party coming in, and we make it very clear whatever is said in those groups is kept confidential, and it's the aggregate information that the employer gets. Now, a quantitative survey can be helpful, and we just created internally basically no more than 20 to 25 questions that simply try to capture the pulse of the organization. Do people feel respected and valued and acknowledged? Do people know what to do if they were harassed? Would they do something? It's really just capturing sort of some information and can be useful as a benchmark after a year or two of doing some of the responsive work. So why are they good? I mean, basically, they give you a lot of information. They can identify some potential hotspots. They can surface what is working well. It's one of the other problems with quantitative surveys. You don't necessarily find out what is working well in these questions. And then it can help you develop a targeted strategic plan. So the firm that I'm at, Morgan Lewis, has done a number of cultural assessments, and there are various themes that have come out of them that I think are all, can be expected in terms of people feeling that they don't really know what to do or they fear retaliation. Two things I would note here that have come out of cultural assessments is the fear of some of the men in the organization, and as they call it, the employers pulling the trigger too quickly, or they're just now concerned. Sometimes they say it in the way of concerned about mentoring women, but there's just a feeling of unease. And I think we have to think affirmatively and strategically about how to make sure that everyone feels that issues are going to be dealt with fairly in the workplace. Of course, there's no reason to quote unquote pull the trigger too quickly, but that doesn't mean you don't quickly respond to any concerns. Obviously, no one should feel that for a small act of misconduct, they're going to get fired. That's not helpful. I mean, that could end up chilling reporting. People aren't going to come forward and say that something's going on if they think the person's going to get fired. What they want is for that conduct to stop. But this is all needs to be conveyed by the leadership about the commitment of leadership to create this safe, respectful, inclusive workplace with corrective actions that are fair, timely, proportionate. Okay, so I'm going to lay out a few of the pieces that go into this campaign for a safe, respectful, and inclusive workplace, and I really want to stress the word campaign. Because what I have found is that any number of organizations are doing different pieces of this, but they're very one-off. Like, oh, let's get some different training. Or, okay, let's look at our policy again. Or let's have the leader give a speech. But they're not crafted as part of one overall campaign. And let me tell you, doing a cultural assessment is a phenomenal kickoff to that campaign. Because what you're saying then is, we, the leaders, we want to hear from you. So here's the campaign. So the components of the campaign. First, leadership and accountability. Changing a workplace culture is not easy, but it is doable. And the research is very clear on that. And the research says leaders can shape culture, and it requires three things. The leaders actually have to believe in what they're saying, have to believe that they want a safe, respectful, and inclusive workplace. The leaders have to articulate that. Do not underestimate the power of the spoken word or the written word. It makes a difference when you have an all-hands meeting on some topic that is not about diversity and inclusion or whatever. It's on some other topic, and you start that meeting with reinforcing the commitment of the organization to safety, respect, and inclusion. Don't underestimate the power of the oral word or the written word. But then the third element is that employees have to feel that those leaders are authentic. Leaders say a lot of things. Employees have to feel that leaders mean what they say. And the key piece of that, obviously, are the actions the leaders take. The most important action is that of accountability, holding people accountable when they are undermining the safe, respectful, and inclusive workplace that you as a leader have just articulated is incredibly important to you. And there are three different groups you need to be holding accountable. Obviously, anyone who herself or himself engages in behavior that makes someone feel not safe, not respected, not included. You also need to hold accountable those individuals in the organization who are responsible for responding to a complaint about disrespectful or harassing behavior. The ones who are supposed to do something when they hear that complaint or if they see that behavior. Those individuals need to be held accountable if they don't respond in the way that you have articulated that you expect that they will respond. And the third group is anyone who retaliates. Anyone who retaliates against someone who has come forward to report disrespectful or harassing behavior, or anyone who has, in an investigation, corroborated that behavior, any person who retaliates against those individuals must be held accountable, because that is the only way you will stop what is currently a negative circle, feedback loop in so many organizations where someone says something, reports, and then that person is retaliated against, sometimes just socially within the organization, sometimes professionally. That absolutely will stop other people from coming forward. So 3 groups of people must be held accountable: those who engage in the behavior that undermines a safe, respectful, and inclusive workplace, those who are responsible as managers or supervisors for responding to those complaints or behaviors, and anyone who retaliates against someone who has complained or corroborated such behavior. If you have leadership and you have accountability, then your policies, procedures, and training are essential. They fill out your comprehensive campaign for a safe, respectful, and inclusive workplace. If you don't have leadership and you don't have accountability, these policies, procedures, and training are not going to do very much. But if you have the leadership and accountability, these are key. So I'm going to say just a few things about each of these. Policies, they should be short, simple, not heavy on the law. As a lawyer, let me tell you, you do not want your policies to sound legalistic. Your employees do not need to know the legal standard of harassment. They don't need to know what is severe or pervasive or whatever other legal words are used. They need to know what type of behavior will not be accepted in the workplace, what they should do if they experience that behavior, what will happen once they report it, and that the organization is committed to ensuring there is not retaliation. That's what the policy needs to include. Your procedures, the key things I would say about your procedures are the following. 1, make sure there are multiple avenues for people to report. Sometimes people can go to their direct supervisor if it's a coworker that's harassing them. Sometimes they don't want to go to their own supervisor because that supervisor is buddies with the person who is harassing or acting in a disrespectful manner, and they want to go to someone else. There have to be different avenues of reporting. And second, take the person seriously. The system, the procedures have to take the person seriously. That does not mean that the person taking in the report automatically assumes that what the person is saying is true. I mean, that's the point of having an investigation. What it means is that the person taking in the report, whether it's the supervisor or HR or anyone else, that the first thing that person says is, thank you. Thank you for coming forward. If what you say is happening, that is wrong, and we will stop it. And here's what's going to happen next. That's taking the person seriously. And it is essential that your procedures are set up so that happens. And again, back to accountability. If a supervisor, if an HR person tries to push something under the rug, that person is held accountable. So let me tell you, as a supervisor, when you've had at the end of a long day and someone comes up to you to complain, and of course, let's say it's the person who's your, the person who doesn't perform quite well generally, and she or he is now complaining about your best performer, the last thing you want to say is, thank you. But you know what? That's actually essential. Thank you for coming forward, because by coming forward, you are helping us create a safe, respectful, and inclusive workplace. But then again, of course, the procedures must be fair, timely, and fair. And any corrective action then has to be proportionate. Proportionality is key. Obviously, you cannot have a system where someone engages in egregious behavior and then they get a slap on the wrist. That will undermine your message of caring about a safe, respectful, and inclusive workplace more than anything else. And it doesn't matter how high up in the organization the person is. But it also means that because you were trying to nip bad behavior in the bud before it reaches to a level where you might have to fire someone, it also means that the corrective action that those procedures will put in place is often much less than termination. So, diversity and inclusion. So, safe, respectful, and inclusive. Diverse and inclusive workplace. My main feeling on this is truly to keep it simple. I feel there are lots of words that have been written about diversity and inclusion, and my main feeling is keep it simple. Figure out what diversity means in your organization. Articulate for yourself what inclusiveness would be like in your organization. What would it feel like for people to feel included? And then set a few simple actions and goals to start with. And, we do a fair amount of this. There are various things I'm sure that most of the people listening to this, I'm assuming, have done some, if not all, of these efforts. And they're all very important and helpful. I mean, you're thinking about what you're doing in terms of recruiting. You're thinking in terms of analyses of your demographics. You're looking to see that you have the mechanisms in place, whether it's affinity groups or diversity and inclusion councils, that lets you do the diversity and inclusion work. So I'm going to end with some comments about training before going into a Q&A time with Kathy. So many organizations move right away to, okay, well, let's get good training. Training is essential, truly essential. But it is not your only effort. It's not your primary effort. In my mind, it should be your capstone effort. If you've got leadership, you've got accountability, you've got good policies and procedures, then training is both what enables you to convey information to your employees about the expectations, and also allows you to put time and money into giving your employees the skills they need to then collectively create that workplace culture of safety, respect, and inclusion. So, the foundational training is what we call compliance training. And we came up with that term. This was during the work at the task force, and it was one of the lawyers, management lawyers at the task force, who said when he starts his anti-harassment training, he starts by saying, I'm not here to change your mind. This isn't training to change your mind, this is training to keep your job. Or I like to say, training not to be disciplined on the job in terms of proportionality. That is, this is going to be some training in which the employer is telling folks, here is the type of behavior we expect you to engage in if you're going to be working for us. And you're not in 2 hours going to change someone's mind about something. So for example, some guy says, well, why can't I tell Susan she looks sexy in that dress? My wife loves it when I say that. You're like, okay, go home, say that to your wife. Might need to say it to her more often. But when you walk into this workplace, that's not how we act. And again, on any number of types of behavior, the goal is not to necessarily change someone's mind about whether it's okay or not. It's about setting the expectation. Now, ultimately, we do hope that we can change how people feel internally. But the key thing in terms of compliance training is to set the expectations of the behavior people must comply with in order to be at that organization. So then, there are various other elements in terms of having this type of foundational training work well? Number one, really good to use a live trainer. I mean, sometimes that's not going to work. You've got people far-flung in who knows how many countries. Sure, you can use some web-based training that itself can be interactive, but to the extent you can use a live trainer, the better. Absolutely using examples from your own workplace. That's what's going to connect with people. Just explain what is not acceptable in the workplace. You should not be spending a lot of time on what is illegal. We now have some state and local laws that have mandatory training, and unfortunately they sometimes say, and you have to explain the legal definition. I'm like, fine, do one slide, explain the legal definition because you have to. That's not where you're focusing your attention, because you're trying to tell people, here's behavior that we want to stop before it rises to the level of being illegal. You explain the steps that will happen in an investigation if someone is reporting, and you make it clear that there will not be retaliation. So that's the foundational, as I say, compliance training. You're giving information to folks. There are three other types of training that we think are helpful in providing skills to your employees to create the culture that you and they want. So the first is called Respectful Workplaces Training. This is not based on any status. So again, a lot of the information that is given in a compliance anti-harassment training usually focuses on statuses that are protected under the law. Sex, race, religion, disability, age, sexual orientation, gender identity, all very important to explain to people how harassing behavior can occur on those bases. But Respectful Workplaces Training moves away from any status base and simply says we all would like to have a workplace in which people are treated in a respected manner. So it's creating first a sense of collective responsibility for that type of workplace, articulating what are things that make people feel respected or disrespected. And people all know that, but it's articulating it together in a group. And then, very importantly, it's teaching people the skills of how to give feedback if they experience disrespectful behavior, because that's not easy to do, and how to receive that feedback if you get it, because that's also not easy. Neither of these come naturally to us, and yet there is training that can be done that helps people develop these skills. And it teaches supervisors how to coach problematic employees. Because in the general training you're doing for supervisors, in your compliance training, there's a section that says to supervisors and managers, we will hold you accountable if you don't take the steps you need to take. But if you're also trying to nip bad behavior in the bud, right? Uncivil behavior can be the gateway drug to illegal harassment. You need to give some skills training to your managers about how to, in fact, coach problematic employees, stop that behavior early. This can be your way in to the type of management training that I think we all know managers can often use. Diversity and inclusion training. I like to now call it conversations. I think the research is mixed in terms of how some of this training works out. But in fact, you can do conversations in which you can share information about stereotypes, talk about disrupting the bias, and can reinforce the Respectful Workplaces training. And then finally, bystander intervention training. So people do not like to see harassment going on around them. But often they don't know what to do, or they are afraid to do anything. Sometimes they just feel it's not their problem. But often people feel like they don't want to see that. Bystander intervention training does the following things. It reinforces the fact that this is our problem, all of us. It makes it clear what behavior is not acceptable. That's hopefully reinforcing training you've already done. And then it gives people realistic options of what to do. Because in a workplace, different power dynamics, some things will be realistic for a bystander to do and others not. There might be something that can be immediate if someone's at the same power level of someone else, that they can intervene and stop something or say something directly to the person afterwards. It could be simply that the person knows where to go to report, delegate it to someone else. Or it could be simply going to the person who is the target and saying, that made me uncomfortable. How did you feel? And can I help you in maybe dealing with this? It is both empowering bystanders and giving them realistic options. So that's the overall campaign. My guess, my hope is that a huge amount of what I've already said has resonated for you because you're like, yeah, that's what I've been doing, or that's what I've wanted to do. And then hopefully some additional stuff of, oh, that would be good to now add this to what I'm doing, either as a practical matter or just as a conceptual matter as to why something will work. So with that, I'm coming over to you.
Thank you so much, Hai. Thank you. Your wisdom and knowledge is so important to us. We always feel smarter when you're in the room. Thank you so much for being here today. We're going to take a deeper dive into what leaders should know and do. But first, I want to do a time check. And so we talk about this significant moment. We know that a year and a half ago, some extraordinary journalism exposed a wave of really egregious sexual misconduct scandals, not only in the media industry, but in all industries across the board. I can't think of one that probably didn't have some heightened awareness about this at the very least. So we are highly aware. We know that real change takes time, but I think there's a real interest in knowing from you, who both saw the evolution post October 2017 at the EEOC and now at Morgan Lewis as you survey industries. What's happening now? Where are we on that clock as we move forward toward what we hope is transformational change?
I think we are where we should probably expect ourselves to have been, which means not anywhere near where we have to be, but it has moved. I think if we were sitting here almost 2 years after Weinstein, and there was practically nothing we could see in terms of actual organizations other than the stories that have been written, that would have been really unfortunate. And I don't think, from what I can see, that's not what I see happening. So what I see is that entities, people within organizations, and they might have been in HR, they might have been in the C-suite, they have started a conversation internally, and they have started some piece of action. This is what I say, that I feel I see the one-offs. They've started one thing here or one thing there, but they haven't actually, what I haven't seen as much is thinking about it as an overall campaign that they have messaged internally to their employees and externally about here are the steps we're going to take. So I think there is definitely an interest, and I think there are always some specific steps. Often the first step has been new training, which is fine, especially if you get the type of training that Jill Geisler does, and things that are incredibly skills-based. But that has to then be part of, well, what's going to be the next step after that?
Yeah. I love the idea of a campaign. And I think that really makes sense for people who, as you say, are doing one-offs and want to figure out how do you make this a strategic campaign. In the C-suite, there's a lot of competing needs, right? And one of the biggest questions has to be, how do you make this fit into those competing needs, and how do you make this a priority? And you've given people a business case today. You've given people strategies and tactics as part of a campaign, which is awesome. But also, you've mentioned that leaders have to speak in an authentic voice to be heard. Explain that a little bit more. How do you get an authentic voice? How does this work?
So the most important thing, right, is that the leader actually believes it. I mean, That's really the key, right? So if you're the leader and you're not sure if you completely believe it, then that's on you to start talking to people to say, I want to know more. I want to understand why this is so important. But I think for a lot of leaders, you do believe it. Again, anyone sitting here, you're thinking about your leader, you know your leader does believe it. But then it's about talking to that person about how that person can articulate it in a way that doesn't sound one-off to the employees. I mean, this is back exactly to this piece of the needs of the organization. Right? The need of the organization is to have the best possible work being done. And the way you're going to get the best possible work out of folks is for them to feel safe, respected, and included. This is at the very core of what the C-suite should be caring about. The very core.
You know, and speaking to that point, we talk a lot about diversity and inclusion, but sometimes those words lose some value in our conversation. They almost become too heavily used and not well enough explained or understood. And in my thinking, or the way I've heard it described, very, very basically, diversity gets you in the door, inclusion keeps you there. But I don't think people understand inclusion very well. So could you talk a lot about, in your work, about the power of inclusion. And we've heard that at the PowerShift Summit and other meetings that we've convened, that people need a path. They need a pathway to positions of power and respect. How does define inclusion a little bit more and how it should work for leaders?
So this is part of where I come back to keeping it simple.
Mm-hmm.
If you ask someone, what makes you feel respected? Just simple social cues.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's things like being asked your opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Or after you've been asked your opinion, having it feel like it's been listened to.
Mm-hmm.
It's eye contact. It's saying hello in the morning. It's amazing. If you do this with a group and you just ask them, just say these cues and you put them on the whiteboard, literally, someone we've been working with has been doing this for 30 years, 99% of the cues are the same, right? People often don't do them though, right? And for people who have been in groups that have often not been acknowledged, those are the folks who are often even more likely not to experience having their opinion asked for, being involved in some decision making, having hello said to that person.
Mm-hmm.
To me, the best way to focus on inclusion is to first focus on how do we have this respectful workplace generally, and then realizing that these lack of connections with people can happen even more with the folks who are not the norm in the group. So literally, that's the most basic. Now, if you then start asking someone's opinion and actually listening, then you're thinking, oh, well, that person should also be involved in thinking about this project, right? And then you have that person involved in that project and you're thinking, oh, this person should be asked to do something else. It's almost so basic in terms of common sense. But unless you think about it, unless you take that moment to think, are the people here feeling respected and acknowledged? And is there a difference in terms of how people are feeling? Because that's going to make someone leave when you want that person to stay.
That's really important, but structural changes are important too. And what are some of the things that leaders in media organizations can and should be doing to create those pathways and to create those structural cultural changes that make a difference?
Yes. So you have to start, as you say, with that sort of culture, but then it's about expectations. So how many times have you had someone where the person has left, you need to fill the job, and I need to fill the job right away, and I know exactly who should be there, who just happens to look just like you.
Right.
It's like, no, you know what? In our applicant pool, we're gonna have a diverse applicant pool. That's just how we're gonna do it. And you know what? HR can be working ahead of time to making sure that there is a whole pool of people. Because when someone needs to hire someone right away, they usually do need to hire someone right away. You want to have a pool of people that you've been already developing. When it comes to promotions, well, why is it that this person who's not a diverse candidate got promoted and the other person didn't? Now, having the qualified person get the job is essential. It's legally essential, and it's just essential overall. But you have to be able to ask yourself, well, why was I thinking that this person wasn't as good? It's being curious about yourself, questioning yourself, but having the leadership have expectations of you in terms of hiring, in terms of providing assignments, in terms of doing promotions. It's about being intentional about those employment decisions. And then it's about making sure you've got the structures. I mean, if you don't have a diversity and inclusion council, you should. I mean, there are things that that type of council can do that will keep things moving. If you don't have affinity groups, you should. If you haven't done an assessment of pay, a pay equity audit, you should. I mean, these are structural things that if you haven't done an assessment of where are we recruiting from and who are we are there places we can recruit from that will get us a more diverse pool, you should do that.
And really important is that you start with diverse representation at the top and amongst your leaders, right? So that that's reflected in how the company thinks and operates.
Nothing could be more important than having diverse representation at leadership. Absolutely. It's like you can say all the words you want, but if people feel like they don't see it, then it's not going to ring true. And that also means that you're hiring into your leadership, both from within. You want to make sure that you've got that people are moving up. And if you need to diversify your leadership by taking folks from outside, you got to be able to break through and say, we're going to take folks from outside.
So what we hear a lot at the Power Shift Summit and our other convenings is something people call fix-it fatigue. They are asked to be on the Diversity Council. They're asked to be on a diverse hiring panel. They have a day job and then they have a second job, they feel, to some extent. How do you factor that in? How should leaders think about that in terms of creating these strategies in organizations?
So leaders absolutely have to understand that that feeling exists. You know, I'm an African-American woman, let's say, I want to be able to do my job as opposed to not also being on every diversity initiative. You know, I'm a lesbian, I want to feel like, you know, I don't have to go to every gay pride, you know, event that they do. Although, as a lesbian, I do go to every gay pride event, but in any event. So leaders have to understand that there is that feeling, and the best way to make sure that you can have enough diverse folks is to hire enough diverse folks.
Right.
So like understand that issue so that you understand that if you just have 2 African-American women, you're going to have a problem, right? So you want to have more. The second is, from my perspective, also having it feel like a collective responsibility. So to say to an African-American woman who has already served on a committee once, okay, we don't want you to feel you have to serve on it again. Problem solve with me. Is there someone that you feel can carry through and have some of these understandings, right? An ally who really can, who does get it, and let's have that person. But you're bringing that person in to problem solve. And say right up front, I know the best way to solve this problem is to have more diverse people in this workforce. I'm totally there. And now let's see what else we can do.
Well, to that point, we all know, or I think we're becoming more aware, that harassment and discrimination are inextricably linked. And even with incivility, throw that in there too. Talk a little bit about those intersectional issues more and why they matter so much for leaders to understand.
Right, so I would say 2 things. One is, before you even get to intersectionality, to really have leaders be able to talk about all the bases that this harassment or disrespect can happen on the basis of. You don't want people to feel like, oh, they just care about sexual harassment.
Right.
No, we care about harassment and disrespect on any of these bases. So if you start very clearly with that, then the commitment to making sure that this type of harassment isn't happening on an intersectional basis makes even more sense, right? Because then you're saying, we want to make sure women feel respected here and not harassed. We want to make sure that African Americans feel respected here and not harassed. Well, we know from the research that African American women will experience a different type sometimes of disrespect. Sometimes it's not even harassment. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's just devaluing. So you have to, as a leader, train yourself, hire people who can tell you this is the type of things that could happen to an African American woman or Hispanic woman. And so that your structural changes, your solutions, have to be able to deal with that intersectional issue as well. But you have to understand what can happen to women. You have to understand what can happen to African Americans or Latinos or people with disabilities to then understand how the intersectionality can be even different and worse.
Tell us a little bit more how that works. What's the evidence and what's the research on the multiplier effect on, say, an African American woman or a transgender woman or a woman with disability?
Right. So let's take a woman with a disability, right? So you could have a situation where you're feeling like, you know, women overall are, you know, you've gotten it in place, and so people are at least understand how you treat women or men. I mean, it's, right? You might have had, in terms of some disability training, actually, I don't want to use disability because the truth is we have such a way to go in terms of disability. I feel we are so not there, especially in terms of understanding people with hidden disabilities. But the research is really more there in terms of race.
Right.
So you might be fine about, you know, dealing with a black guy. That could be just completely fine. You have respect. You might be fine about dealing with a woman, but you're just not fine with dealing with a black woman. Black woman, you think, will be angry, will be shrill, will be, you know, and that is how you think. That is your stereotype. And again, it's often not even necessarily malicious, some of it, but that's your stereotype. If the point is in the training, and it doesn't have to be a big thing, it's just highlighting for someone, this could play out in this way when these two characteristics intersect.
Also, one of the things that was the most powerful at the first PowerShift Summit was when Sharon Masling, your colleague at Morgan Lewis, former chief of staff at EOC, talked about the risk factors that undergird this whole system. And there were things that some of us had never even thought about before. Can you tell us a little bit about what the major risk factors for harassment and discrimination in the workplace are?
Yes. So what's so interesting about how we got into looking at the risk factors for the report was one of the lawyers in the task force said, well, we're all talking about prevention.
Right.
We all want this we don't want this to happen in the first place. Because if it happens, it's bad for everyone. So let's talk about what employers could think about ahead of time as causing the risks. And it was amazing how there had really been nothing written looking at that overall.
Right.
So a risk factor doesn't mean that harassment and discrimination will happen. It just means it's potentially more likely, so you want to think about it. So a risk factor of a homogenous workplace. You know, if you're the first few women or black people or Muslims, whatever, coming into a workplace, that's a risk factor. So number one, what you want to do is diversify. Right. But also be aware, as you know, the need for folks to have diversity. But another risk factor is an influx of people who are diverse into a place that has been homogenous. So again, you're diversifying, but you have to be very aware of the reaction that people might have. Young workers, that's a risk factor. If you have a workplace with a lot of young workers, they often don't, it might have be their first job, they don't even know how to act, or they don't know what their rights are. Or sometimes you have managers who are then young and they don't know how to manage. Decentralized workplace. You can have a fantastic HR at headquarters. If you have lots of decentralized workplaces, you have to figure out a way to get that culture understanding into all of those places. Jobs with significant power disparities. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. But again, thinking ahead of time, where are the power disparities? Jobs that are boring. It turns out that's a risk factor. If you're a security guard and it's, you know, a bunch of security guards and you're just trying to figure out, oh, we're just having fun, right? So there are 12 risk factors that we list. I will say the last risk factor, all of these are basically specific to the workplace. The last one was what we called coarsened public discourse. So it's not really a particular workplace. It's recognizing that what goes on outside of the workplace can have an impact inside the workplace. It's a risk factor. So it's being aware what's going on out there and what can I as a leader do to say inside this space, that doesn't happen.
Sometimes a personal journey can help inform other leaders' journeys. And you're the first out EOC commissioner in the history in the history of the EOC. You've seen a lifetime of your own personal reactions in the workplace, and then you've been an enormous leader for change. Can you talk a little bit about what you've been through and how you as a leader use that to inform your own leadership style and aspirations, an authentic voice?
An authentic voice, yeah. So I was saying to someone recently, I mean, I came out in 1979. I mean, I came out when I was 20 years old. Certainly way before it was often felt safe.
Right.
But to me, it was just who I was. Like, of course, I was just going to be out about who I was. And to be honest, the year before, I had become not religious. I had grown up as a very Orthodox Jew.
Right.
And then I had decided that I didn't believe in God, and I left Orthodox Judaism. And by the way, that was way more traumatic than coming out as a lesbian. But both of those are about being authentic. And, you know, we want the best out of people. We want people to be able to live their lives feeling that it is a life of dignity and integrity. And so the worst thing, I think, is when people feel they have to keep quiet and feel ashamed. I mean, by definition, keeping quiet means you're feeling ashamed. We don't want a world like that. And the fact is, we have come so far in this country in terms of allowing people to come out and then be validated about that. And so many times, over and over again, I've seen over the years, right? This has now been 40 years of being out and working with people and working in this movement, and people are always more afraid of what the response is going to be about coming out than it usually is. Unfortunately, there are places in this country where it still is not safe to come out. And it is about the leaders. I mean, young people have to see leaders who have come out, and been successful. And especially on things that are hidden. You know, you don't know that I'm a lesbian unless I say it to you, or I've come out to you, because I fit the gender stereotype, right, of a woman. Like, often when I would give speeches, and my bio always said, first out lesbian commissioner, and somehow in the bio, that wasn't put in, right? And then, so I'd be talking to the audience and doing the legal analysis and say, how many of you thought when I came up here, oh my goodness, that must be the first out lesbian commissioner? Not usually, right? I have to come out. Same thing in terms of hidden disabilities. I have to come out and say, I have the disability of anxiety disorder. Otherwise, you wouldn't know it.
Right.
Diagnosed, medicated, I've been able to live my life, right? But we have to destigmatize, whether it's being gay, transgender, disability, etc.
So in a way, you've turned that into your superpowers, right? You've taken, really, you've used that as part of your authentic voice as a leader. And talk a little bit about how, was that a struggle, or was that something that came very natural? And how can other leaders take those same things and make them part of their authentic work?
So, you know, it comes back to that first thing of leaders have to believe, right, in whatever it is that they're saying. So you have to think, as a leader, what are the pieces that make up my identity, including things that maybe other people didn't know about, and that I'm now going to own and be proud of. I mean, we want everyone to be able to come to work and be proud of who they are. Then as a leader, you want to think about, who am I? And how am I going to convey that to the people I'm working with? So maybe it's a story about how they had a stereotype about someone and how that stereotype got blown away. Maybe not something they would ordinarily think about talking about. Hey, talk about it. Own up to the fact that you had that stereotype. And this is who, you know, changed it for you. Own what you learn. Own what you learn and then convey it to others.
And you've seen over your lifetime transformational change in our culture and in our legal systems about gender orientation and acceptance of it in many places, not all. How's that reflected in the workplace? And what are you seeing in the data and the statistics at the EOC and in your own work about how far we have to go in terms of that?
So in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity, it's like it's night and day, and yet.
Yes, right.
There's no doubt that people feel, many more people feel like they can be out, certainly in terms of being lesbian, gay, bisexual. You know, for transgender folks, I think we definitely have to recognize if I'm a trans woman, as far as I'm concerned, I'm a woman. So I may or may not want to identify as a transgender woman, right? It's just that if I'm transitioning, let's say, on the job, it has to be that the job is such that it will accept me fully. So I think without a doubt, more people feel comfortable, more people around LGBT people sort of understand us. But discrimination is still going on. I mean, at all levels, in all types of occupations. So, you know, people should have their eyes on the Supreme Court this coming year, because the Supreme Court now has 3 cases in which they will decide whether, when I was at the EOC, what the EOC decided about sex discrimination, including discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. That is, whether LGBT people are covered right now under sex discrimination law. The Supreme Court will be deciding that this coming year. And I will tell you, LGBT people need legal protection against discrimination in the workplace. No matter how good a workplace thinks it is, people need that legal protection.
And in that regard, religious freedom in the workplace is another hot button issue, particularly in this very diverse country. What's the data on discrimination to religious beliefs, and how do you see that evolving as we continue to become a nation that is many religions or none?
Right. So as I said, I grew up as an Orthodox Jew.
Right.
So even though I'm not religious anymore, I have a huge respect for people who are religious, especially those who are not of the norm in this country. So I believe we must be committed to religious pluralism in this country if we are to be the type of country we want to be. That means that in the employment settings, employers need to respect and accommodate, when they can, religious beliefs and practices. Understand what harassment on the basis of religion can look like, put that into their training, because we do see discrimination and harassment on the basis of religion. I think in terms of sometimes when people feel religious beliefs and LGBT rights conflict, I think there it's about just being very clear and honest about what's going on. Again, as someone who grew up religious, I have lots of cousins who think homosexuality is sinful. I don't think they're bad people. I think that's what they believe. That's what God has told them. I don't think they should be harassed for that. But I think that in the workplace, they can't harass someone else.
Yeah.
So we can work together on this. We just have to be people of faith, whether it's religious faith or not. It's about faith in the goodness of each other.
Right.
That's what we have to have.
I hear so often people say they just want to bring their whole selves to work, and that's actually going to make them better workers and more productive. And that's sort of an insight for leaders to have in this arena, right? How do you make the workplace respectful and welcoming to everyone's whole self, whether it be a different religion or a different sexuality or a different race or ethnicity?
And I think thinking the word authentic. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not even sure. Some people go whole self, and what the hell is that? And what are they bringing here? It's, you know what? You want people to feel that they can be authentic at work and be treated with dignity and respect. Just go there, and you will have a good workplace.
Okay. In the minutes that we have left, let's drill down a little bit and talk about some things like we all hear that measure what matters. You talked a lot about data being something that's important to undergird any conversation with. But there's an apprehension about too much transparency around issues like pay equity and others in companies. How do leaders bust through that while being responsible to their own organizations, but also being beginning to lead the charge for this transformational change that requires that kind of measurement and data to move forward?
Right. So I'm so glad you asked that, because it's certainly something I've been seeing now even more at Morgan Lewis. Don't try to think about doing some of these projects without talking with your legal folks and bringing them in as partners. So, you know, I won't say the name, but I was just looking at, one of these culture type surveys, right, that had been done, and HR had done it, and now they had 53 slides on their PowerPoint, and they wanted to send it out to everyone, the survey about how people felt about everything. And the lawyer's calling me saying, oh my God, I don't want all that information out there. Now, I was able to say to her, look, I know that the way the research goes, if you're going to ask a lot of information, you have to be willing to give information back. But what you want to do is have your strategic plan ahead of time about what it is that you're asking and what it is that you're going to be giving back out. Because that was just a very nice, sort of off-the-shelf, quantitative survey that they hadn't brought their lawyers in as partners. I said, you're not the police person, but you're the partner. So whether it's about pay, whether it's about surveys about how people are feeling, okay, you want to think about legally, what is it that you're going to be wanting to share? Just be smart about that ahead of time. But also, strategically, you're sharing for what purpose? So to just share and then say, and now we're going to go back and think about what we're going to do, that's unhelpful, because I said to the lawyer, so, and what are they planning to say about what they're going to do after they have these 53? Oh, they're not quite sure yet. I'm like, okay, well, that's a bad way to share. Share with a plan. So I believe very strongly that transparency can be key after you have asked information from your employees. If you've asked, you've got to be able to share back. But just think strategically ahead of time. What is it that you're asking? What are you going to share back? And what are you going to do?
And finally, as we lead into our next segment on how to be a great ally in the workplace, we often talk about this by default as a woman's issue. It's all of our issues. Men are incredibly important allies to have in this change. We also talk about a backlash that's happening since this moment of significance. And there's a difference between your cautions against zero tolerance and also wiping out mentorship programs, for instance, because of that concern and that fear. Let's close by talking about what you see as where leaders can step up to mediate that fear and concern that is, maybe, some people think could hijack the movement a little bit. What do you think about that?
So one of the reasons I like talking about respect as opposed to just harassment is that there are female bosses who are acting in ways that are not respectful and are bullying, right? And that is as unacceptable in the workplace as a man who is sexually harassing a younger woman, right? So if that's what you're saying is what we're wanting in the workplace, right? Then everyone is an ally to each other, okay? So that's sort of one basic thing. And then the second thing is to say, to men, we're going to take seriously concerns that you have, and let's problem solve this together. Not mentoring women is not creating the diverse and inclusive workplace we want, right? We can all agree on that. Let's hear what it is you're actually worried about, and let's problem solve. Like, don't take your mentees out to the bar at night. Just don't do that. Go have coffee, right? I mean, just some specific issues. Let's problem solve together.
Thank you, Hai, so much for bringing your incredible knowledge to bear on this issue and for your continuing work in the field. And may we partner together as we move forward at the Power Shift Project with you and Morgan Lewis and others in this great cause for transformational change. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.